the burden of pleasing and the nature of ethical action. Saying no is one of the most challenging things we face in our lives. It is not because the word itself is difficult to utter. It's a simple word, monosyllabic and direct. The reason saying no feels so heavy is because of the emotional and moral weight we attach to it. Deep down, many of us equate refusal with rejection, selfishness, or an act of moral failure. We fear disappointing others, being seen as unkind, or even being ostracized from the relationships and communities we value. But is this fear rational? More importantly, is it ethical? To understand this, we must consider the deeper question: what does it mean to act ethically? Immanuel Kant, the great philosopher of the Enlightenment, offers us a framework that not only clarifies this question, but also liberates us from the guilt that often accompanies our refusal to please others. For Kant, the foundation of morality is not rooted in social approval, emotional comfort, or even the outcomes that our decisions bring about. Instead, morality is grounded in the principle of rational autonomy, the idea that to act ethically is to act according to principles that are freely chosen by our rational will, and that could be universalized without contradiction. To put it simply, Kant believes that the moral worth of an action lies not in its consequences but in the intention behind it. If you say yes out of fear, obligation, or the desire to avoid conflict, you are not acting freely or morally. You are succumbing to external pressures, allowing your will to be compromised by forces outside of your rational self. But if you say no because you have recognized that the request contradicts a principle you hold as universally valid, you are not being selfish, you are being ethical. This brings us to a critical insight: every time you say yes when you truly mean no, you are not only betraying yourself, but you are also failing to act ethically. You are prioritizing the comfort of others, or perhaps your own avoidance of discomfort, over your duty to act with integrity. And here is where guilt enters the picture. Guilt arises not because we have abandoned others, but because in betraying ourselves, we violate the fundamental moral principle of autonomy. Kant would argue that this is why guilt feels so corrosive, so destabilizing. It is not merely a social emotion, but a signal from our rational mind that we have acted contrary to our own ethical nature.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
So what should we do when we are faced with a request, a demand, or an expectation that we feel compelled to fulfill, even though it conflicts with our own values, needs, or priorities? The first step is to pause and ask ourselves a question that penetrates to the very heart of our ethical being. If everyone acted as I am about to act, would the resulting world be one I could rationally endorse? This is Kant's famous categorical imperative, and it is a powerful tool for cutting through the fog of guilt and uncertainty. If your yes would lead to a world in which individual autonomy and rational freedom are undermined, then saying yes is unethical, no matter how much pressure you feel to comply. Consider this example. A friend asks you to take on a task that you know will overwhelm you and disrupt the commitments you have already made to yourself and others. Your immediate instinct might be to say yes, driven by the fear of disappointing your friend or being perceived as unkind. But pause for a moment. If you say yes out of fear or obligation, what kind of world are you contributing to? A world in which people are expected to sacrifice their well-being for the sake of avoiding discomfort. A world in which relationships are built on coercion rather than mutual respect. Is this a world you could rationally endorse as just and good? The answer is almost certainly no. By saying yes in this situation, You are not strengthening the bonds of friendship, you are weakening them by allowing the relationship to be governed by unspoken expectations and emotional manipulation rather than honesty and respect. And here is the paradox: when you say no from a place of integrity, you are not rejecting the other person, you are honoring them as a rational being capable of understanding and respecting your autonomy. But here's the deeper challenge: how do you deal with the guilt that arises even when you know you've made the right decision? Kant would remind us that guilt, like pain, is not inherently bad. It is a signal, a guide, a reminder of what matters most. When you feel guilty for saying no, ask yourself, is this guilt arising because I have violated a moral principle, or is it arising because I have violated an expectation? These are not the same thing. Expectations are often arbitrary, shaped by cultural norms, personal insecurities, and unspoken social contracts. Moral principles, on the other hand, are grounded in reason and universality. If your guilt arises from the former, it is not your enemy, it is an opportunity to reaffirm your commitment to living an authentic and ethical life. At this point, you might be thinking, but what about kindness? Isn't it unkind to say no? Doesn't kindness sometimes require us to put others' needs above our own? Kant would agree that kindness is a virtue, but he would insist that it must be practiced within the bounds of rational morality. True kindness is not about self-sacrifice, it is about acting in ways that respect the autonomy and dignity of all parties involved, including yourself. To say yes when you mean no is not an act of kindness, it is an act of deception, both toward yourself and toward the other person. It creates a relationship built not on mutual respect but on unspoken resentment and suppressed truth. Let's take a moment to confront a question that cuts to the core of this discussion. How often do you say yes to others because you are afraid to say no to yourself? How often do you prioritize the comfort of others over your own integrity, not because you truly believe it is the right thing to do, but because you lack the courage to face the discomfort of standing firm? And here's the harder question: what kind of life are you creating for yourself and for others when you make this choice? You see, every no you utter is not just a refusal, it is an affirmation. It is a declaration of what you stand for, what you value, and what you are willing to fight for. When you say no to a demand that violates your principles, you are not being selfish, you are being brave. You are creating a world in which honesty, integrity, and mutual respect are possible. And yes, this will sometimes be uncomfortable. People may be disappointed, angry, or even hurt, but their reactions are not your responsibility. Your responsibility is to act in a way that you can rationally and ethically defend to yourself and to the world. And so we arrive at a profound truth: the guilt we feel when we say no is not a sign that we have done something wrong. It is a sign that we are growing, that we are learning to navigate the complex terrain of human relationships with courage and integrity. It is a sign that we are becoming the kind of person who values ethical action over social approval, who prioritizes truth over convenience, and who understands that the ultimate test of morality is not how others react to our choices, but whether we can stand by them with a clear conscience. If you cannot say no to others, how can you ever say yes to yourself? And if you cannot say yes to yourself, what kind of life are you living? Are you living a life of freedom and authenticity, or a life of silent servitude to the expectations of others? The answer, I suspect, will reveal more than you expect. The freedom to refuse Kant's solution to moral boundaries in relationships. In the face of pressure, we often feel a quiet erosion of our boundaries, like sand slipping away under the weight of the tide. This erosion is subtle, almost imperceptible, but over time it undermines the foundation of our autonomy. When we say yes against our better judgment, when we agree to something that violates our principles, disrupts our peace, or stretches us to the point of breaking it, is not just a moment of discomfort. It is, in a very real sense, a denial of our own humanity. For Kant, this denial is the ultimate ethical failure, because it reduces us to mere instruments for the purposes of others. And yet so many of us live this way, caught in a web of obligations, expectations, and fears, unable or unwilling to say no. To understand how we can break free from this cycle, we must first confront a difficult truth: the inability to say no is not about love, kindness, or generosity. It is about fear. Fear of rejection, fear of conflict, fear of being seen as selfish, unkind, or unworthy. But here's the paradox: when we act out of fear, we are not acting ethically, even if our actions appear outwardly kind or accommodating. Why? Because fear distorts our will. It makes us reactive rather than deliberate, submissive rather than autonomous. And autonomy, for Kant, is the cornerstone of morality. Without it, we are not truly human. We are simply tools, manipulated by the desires and expectations of others. So how do we reclaim our autonomy? How do we find the strength to say no without guilt? The answer lies in a profound shift in perspective. We must stop thinking of no as a rejection of others and start seeing it as an affirmation of our own moral agency. This is not an easy shift to make. It requires us to confront the deeply ingrained belief that our worth is tied to our ability to please others. It requires us to ask, what is my worth if I am not useful, agreeable, or accommodating? And here is where Kant's philosophy offers us a radical and liberating answer: your worth is intrinsic. It does not depend on what you do for others, how much you give, or how well you conform to social expectations. Your worth lies in your capacity to act as a free, rational being who chooses to live in accordance with universal moral principles. Let's break this down. Imagine someone asks you to do something that you know will harm your well-being. Perhaps it's a request to take on extra work when you are already stretched thin, or to attend an event that conflicts with your personal values. Your immediate instinct might be to say yes, either because you don't want to disappoint the person or because you feel obligated to meet their expectations. But pause for a moment. Ask yourself, if I say yes, in this situation, am I acting out of genuine goodwill, or am I acting out of fear, obligation, or the desire to avoid conflict? If the latter, then your yes is not an ethical act, it is a capitulation. And capitulation, no matter how well-intentioned, is not the same as kindness. Kant would argue that when we say yes in these situations, we are not respecting the other person as a rational, autonomous being. Instead, we are reinforcing a dynamic in which the relationship is governed by unspoken expectations, emotional manipulation, or a lack of mutual respect. True respect, Kant would say, requires honesty. It requires us to be clear about our boundaries and to trust that the other person is capable of understanding and respecting them. This is the essence of ethical action: to act in a way that treats both ourselves and others as ends in themselves, rather than as means to an end. But here's the challenge: what happens when others don't respond well to our boundaries? What happens when they become angry, disappointed, or even hostile? This is where the fear of saying no is most powerful, because it taps into our primal need for connection and belonging. We fear that by refusing others, we will lose their love, approval, or acceptance. But Kant reminds us that true connection is only possible when it is grounded in mutual respect and freedom. If someone's love or approval is contingent on your willingness to violate your own principles, then what they are offering is not love, it is control. And to accept this kind of conditional relationship is to betray not only yourself but also the other person, because it denies them the opportunity to engage with you as a free and equal partner. So how do we navigate these moments of conflict and disappointment? How do we say no in a way that is both firm and compassionate? The key lies in what Kant calls the principle of universalizability. Before you make a decision, ask yourself, could this action become a universal law? In other words, if everyone acted as I am about to act, would the resulting world be one I could rationally endorse? If the answer is yes, then your action is ethical, even if it causes discomfort or disappointment in the short term. And if the answer is no, then no amount of good intentions can make it right. This principle is not just a theoretical tool, it is a practical guide for navigating the complexities of human relationships. Let's take an example. Suppose a colleague asks you to take on additional work that you know will overwhelm you. You feel torn on the one hand, you want to help on the other hand, you know that saying yes will compromise your own well-being. What do? If you follow the principle of universalizability, you might ask, would I want to live in a world where everyone feels obligated to say yes to requests that harm their well-being? The answer is almost certainly no. Such a world would be one in which people are constantly overextended, resentful, and unable to care for themselves or others. By saying no, you are not being selfish, you are affirming a principle that promotes balance, respect, and sustainability in relationships. But what about the guilt? What about the sinking feeling that you've let someone down, that you've been unkind, or that you've failed to live up to their expectations? Kant would encourage us to see guilt not as an enemy but as a teacher. Guilt, like any emotion, is a signal. It tells us something about our values, our beliefs, and our relationships. When you feel guilty for saying no, ask yourself, is this guilt arising because I have violated a moral principle, or is it arising because I have violated an expectation? If the latter, then guilt is not a sign that you've done something wrong. It's a sign that you are challenging a pattern, breaking free from a cycle, and learning to live in accordance with your own values. This kind of guilt is not a failure, it is a growing pain. And here is where we must confront one of the most difficult questions of all: what is the price of your integrity? Are you willing to sacrifice your peace, your health, and your values to avoid the discomfort of saying no? Or are you willing to endure the short-term pain of guilt, disappointment, or conflict in order to live a life that is true to your principles? This is not an abstract question, it is a question that each of us must answer again and again in the messy, complicated reality of our daily lives. And the answer, Kant would remind us, is not just about what is good for you, it is about what kind of world you are helping to create. Every no you say is not just a personal decision, it is a moral act, a small but significant step toward a world in which honesty, respect, and freedom are possible. The ethics of the self-choosing freedom over guilt. Let's take a moment to confront an uncomfortable truth. When you say yes to something you don't want to do, when you agree to a request that violates your boundaries, compromises your values, or drains your energy, you are not simply making a bad choice. You are actively participating in your own oppression. You are teaching others that your will, your needs, and your principles are negotiable. And most painfully, you are teaching yourself that your voice does not matter. Over time, this pattern erodes not just your confidence, but your very sense of self. Every untrue yes chips away at the foundation of who you are. Kant would argue that this is the ultimate moral failure, not because it harms others, but because it violates the core of your humanity. For Kant, to be human is to act as a rational, autonomous being who chooses freely and lives according to principles that reflect the dignity of all persons, including yourself. When you surrender your autonomy to the expectations of others, you are not just letting yourself down, you are relinquishing the very thing that makes you human. And this, Kant would say, is a violation not just of your dignity, but of the moral law itself. Let's be clear, saying no is not easy. It forces us to confront the discomfort of conflict, the fear of rejection, and the weight of guilt. But what if this discomfort is not something to avoid, but something to embrace? What if the pain of saying no is not a sign that you are doing something wrong, but a sign that you are doing something right? This is the radical insight that Kant offers you as ethical action is not about avoiding discomfort, it is about choosing integrity over convenience, freedom over fear, and truth over false harmony. To understand this, we need to look more closely at the nature of guilt. Why does saying no feel so wrong, even when we know it is the right thing to do? The answer lies in the stories we tell ourselves about what it means to be good. For many of us, being good means being agreeable, selfless, and accommodating. It means putting others' needs above our own and avoiding conflict at all costs. But where does this idea come from? Is it truly a moral principle, or is it a social construct designed to keep us compliant and controllable? Kant would argue that true morality has nothing to do with compliance. It is not about pleasing others, avoiding conflict, or maintaining social harmony. True morality is about acting according to principles that can be universally justified, principles that respect the dignity and autonomy of all persons, including yourself. When you say yes, out of fear, obligation, or the desire to be liked, you are not acting morally, you are acting as a slave to the expectations of others. And this is why guilt feels so heavy. It is not the guilt of having done something wrong. It is the guilt of having betrayed your own freedom. But here's the paradox: the guilt that comes from saying no feels just as heavy, if not heavier. Why? Because it challenges the deeply ingrained belief that our worth is tied to our ability to please others. When you say no, you are not just refusing a request, you are refusing the idea that your value depends on your willingness to comply. And this is terrifying. It forces you to confront the possibility that others may be disappointed, angry, or hurt. It forces you to stand alone, without the safety net of approval or acceptance. But this, Kant would argue, is the price of freedom. To live authentically, to act ethically, to be truly human, you must be willing to bear the weight of this discomfort. So how do we do it? How do we find the strength to say no without being consumed by guilt? The answer lies in a shift of focus. Instead of asking, "How can I avoid guilt?" ask, "What kind of person do I want to be?" This is not a question about what others expect of you, or even about what will make you happy in the short term. It is a question about your deepest values, your highest principles, and your vision for the life you want to live. When you frame your decisions in this way, guilt loses its power. It becomes not a barrier, but a guide, a reminder of the tension between who you are and who you aspire to be. Here's an exercise to help you navigate this tension. The next time you are faced with a difficult decision, take a moment to imagine yourself at the end of your life. Look back on this moment. Ask yourself, will I be proud of the choice I made? Will I see it as a moment of courage, integrity, and growth? Or will I see it as another instance of betraying myself for the sake of temporary comfort or approval? This exercise is not about avoiding guilt, it is about choosing the kind of guilt you can live with. The guilt of disappointing others is temporary. The guilt of betraying yourself lasts a lifetime. But what about kindness? What about compassion? Surely there are times when saying yes is the right thing to do, even if it costs us something. Kant would agree, but only if the yes is freely chosen, rooted in principle, rather than pressure. True kindness is not about sacrificing yourself for others, it is about recognizing and respecting the dignity of all persons, including yourself. When you say yes out of fear or obligation, you are not being kind, you are being dishonest. You are creating a relationship based on falsehood rather than truth, dependency rather than mutual respect. True kindness requires honesty, courage, and the willingness to say no when it is necessary. Consider this: what kind of relationships do you want to have? Do you want relationships in which your worth is measured by your willingness to comply? Or do you want relationships built on honesty, respect, and mutual understanding? When you say no with integrity, you are not rejecting the other person, you are inviting them into a deeper, more authentic relationship. You are saying, I value you enough to be honest with you. I trust you enough to believe that you can handle my boundaries. And I respect myself enough to honor my own needs and principles. This brings us to a profound realization: saying no is not just an act of self-protection, it is an act of love. Love for yourself, because it affirms your worth as a free and rational being. Love for the other person, because it treats them as an equal capable of understanding and respecting your boundaries. And love for the world, because it contributes to a culture in which honesty, integrity, and mutual respect are possible. But let's not sugarcoat this: saying no will sometimes hurt. It will hurt you because it forces you to confront the fear of rejection and the weight of guilt. And it will hurt others because it challenges their expectations and disrupts their comfort. But this pain is not a sign of failure, it is a sign of growth. It is the price we pay for living authentically, for acting ethically, for being truly human. So here is the final, most difficult question: are you willing to pay that price? Are you willing to endure the discomfort of saying no in order to live a life of integrity, freedom, and truth? Are you willing to disappoint others in order to honor yourself? Are you willing to choose guilt over betrayal, not the guilt of failing others, but the guilt of failing to conform to a world that demands your compliance at the expense of your humanity? The answer to these questions will not come easily. It will require you to confront your deepest fears, your most ingrained beliefs, and the relationships that matter most to you. But Kant would remind us that this is the essence of morality: to act not out of fear, obligation, or desire, but out of a commitment to principles that affirm the dignity and worth of all persons, including yourself. In the end, saying no is not just about refusing a request, it is about reclaiming your freedom, your integrity, and your humanity. It is about choosing to live as a rational, autonomous being who acts according to principles that can be universally justified. It is about creating a life and a world in which honesty, respect, and mutual understanding are possible. And yes, it is about enduring the guilt, the discomfort, and the conflict that come with this choice. Because the alternative is not peace, it is the quiet, insidious erosion of your soul. So the next time you are faced with a difficult decision, Remember this, you are not just saying yes or no to a request, you are saying yes or no to yourself. Choose wisely, choose bravely, and know that in every no spoken with integrity, there is a deeper yes to the person you are meant to be.